Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse. Welcome. Happy New Year. This is the first question and answer on ADHD and mental health of the new year. So I will start by giving a 1-minute synopsis of the 3 videos that were re-released this week after sound was improved on them by Max. And then I'll be open for questions on any of these topics or ADHD in general or mental health in general. And I'm not seeing any pre-existing questions. So the last thing is we're trying to work on setting up a subreddit for question and answers, which may be easier to use and more easy to reference than the YouTube comment section. That is temporarily not suspended. We're waiting, I guess. Reddit has to vet it properly before it can become fully active. So that's in the works, but not set up and active at this moment. So the 3 videos that were re-released this week were ADHD in free time, ADHD in jail, and nicotine and ADHD. So regarding ADHD in free time, my phrase is, if you have ADHD, free time is your enemy because there is much less structure and usually 101 different things that you could do or want to do or might do. And the big answer to doing that is strategy is having a schedule. So it's figuring out what it is that you want to do, how much time you want to spend doing that. That does not mean that every second of the day has to be micromanaged. It also doesn't mean that, as one of the questioners comment, that we're being slaves to the neurotypical world and you're being forced to want to be productive or do things. Lots of people want to do things. I mean, it's fine as if you are just relaxing and chilling and that's okay with you. But so often at the end of the weekend or at the end of a bout of lengthy time off, people with ADHD in particular are regretting that they didn't do X, Y, or Z that they'd wanted to do. So scheduling is your friend. We can talk more about that if you want. Video number 2 is about ADHD in jail. And the statistics are pretty consistent. The extent to which ADHD people are overrepresented in jail varies a lot, but it's certainly way more than the general population. It probably doesn't just reflect that ADHD are more likely to break rules, but also that people with ADHD are more likely to get caught. So again, that attention to details, missing out things that they should have missed or should not have missed, leads to that. Also, the tendency for risk-taking or daredevilry or things that are overtly exciting. Lots of those are exciting because they're breaking the laws and are illegal. But maybe even more importantly is the amazing lack of awareness of ADHD within the prison system. Again, ADHD is highly overrepresented in that population, and yet these are also the inmates who are likely to violate protocols and get in trouble with their fellow inmates and with the custodial authorities. So it makes sense the whole prison will work more smoothly, if that's, I guess, a good thing, probably. If people are with ADHD who benefit from medications, including stimulants, have access to them, again, there'd be less misunderstood, mistaken breaking of the rules within the prison system if that's allowed. And in some limited areas that is allowed. I mean, there have been actually studies showing fewer infractions of rules and more peacefulness on the jail wards when when inmates with ADHD are allowed access to their medications. And then the third video was about nicotine and ADHD. So nicotine receptors are a type of acetylcholine receptors. Nicotine is unusual and it has stimulating properties, but it also has relaxing properties at the same time. And there was a product that drug companies were investigating. They'd gone through, I think, even stage 3 trials, indicating benefit for ADHD symptoms from a nicotine receptor acting agent. That was never brought to market, and I'm not sure what the barriers to that were, what problems came up in the testing. So many people who are smokers or who chew nicotine-based products are aware that it's beneficial for their ADHD symptoms. Clearly, for almost everyone, smoking has much greater health damaging effects than benefits. So probably Nicorette gum, Nicorette patches are a safer way to go. So those are the 3 videos, and I see there's some questions, so I will turn to those. So I can read the message, but not who wrote it. So thank you. Neospios is wishing me well and hoping a good day and that I'm healthy and happy. Thanks. You too. So Max says, hello, on the subject of nicotine, how common is a phenomenon of individuals with undiagnosed ADHD self-medicating without knowing it with nicotine or other substances like caffeine or marijuana? One is sort of by definition, we have almost no hard data because you're asking who has not been identified as having ADHD, but who really has it is benefiting from these other subjects. One is I think it will become increasingly less likely in the future. So I'm in my early 60s. Again, when I was in training, when I was growing up, there was recognition that ADHD existed in children, but none that it existed in adults. And there's a very cohort dependent factor. I mean, there certainly are some people my age or older who are aware of ADHD in adults, but it's still under-recognized, and particularly in 70, 80, 90-year-olds. So I've certainly seen throughout my career a number of individuals in middle age, and just looking at the comments here, there are numerous individuals in the 40s, 50s, 60s who have just learned in the last year or two that they've had ADHD, who have had symptoms for years and years, many of them who did notice benefits. Again, they probably weren't attributing it to ADHD, just, my nerves are upset, or this is calming, or I don't know what. I mean, again, in the early days, not early days, because that goes back thousands of years, but before Surgeon General warnings about cancer's risks and other health risks of cigarettes, a lot of the cigarette manufacturing companies' ads were focused on health and how it gave you zest for life and how it tapped into some of the things that nicotine really actually does. We look at some of those ads sort of with horror and disgust as if they're all completely lies. Some of them are, but some of them were based on the actual properties of nicotine. So Modima Rose says, I remember when Wellbutrin first came to market as a smoking cessation medication and for some depression, that was my first indicator of a drastic improvement. Yeah. So Wellbutrin, bupropion in the US was marketed, it came out first as an antidepressant, and then later subsequent studies indicate it was helpful for smoking cessation, and it got a separate FDA indication under the brand name Zyban. It was used in the same dosage range and is. I mean, it measurably does help increase the rate of quitting cigarettes for people with smoking. It's not a dramatic helps everyone effect, but and people who work at rehab centers, their experience, and there's a little bit of data backing this up, that Wellbutrin probably is not just nicotine specific, but probably helping more with the addiction process in general. So there's some evidence that quitting some other drugs may be easier with Wellbutrin, and Wellbutrin is often the antidepressant of choice used in rehab centers, partly for that. So Neospios asks, regarding ADHD and something akin to Anhedonia, a complete lack of feeling happy or relief. I've been struggling with never feeling happy or accomplished when I attend hobbies or finish my work. So I'd say if we're really solidly in so anhedonia, or lack of being able to have a sense of enjoyment or happiness, I mean, I would put that as a little different from relief. There's certainly lots of people with ADHD who feel, particularly if they're not engaged in hobbies or interests or work or relationships that they're interested in, feel bored or restless or unhappy. But the ability to not feel joy or relief, to me, suggests that perhaps more than ADHD alone is going on, that there is some element of depression. So most individuals that I've worked with ADHD, when they're working on their hobbies or engaged in those, are focused and happy and engaged. And if they achieve something, they're at least briefly very happy or elated. That may not last for a long time, but it's uncommon, again, in the absence of depression, I would say, for there to be, to be engaging in your work or your hobby and accomplishing things and feeling nothing positive about it. So Platinum says, hey doc, I got questions regarding possibly PTSD on a quite sensitive topic for some people. Yeah, certainly you can ask questions here. I guess YouTube does have some rules or regulations, but if we're talking, we're certainly allowed to talk about violence if we're talking about it in a healthful, healing way rather than exploiting or promoting it. So maybe we'll hear more. And in terms of sexual, as long as we're not, again, sexually explicit or exploitative, we're allowed to talk about sex as a normal biological function of not just humans, but most animal species and plant species. So Neospios, I'm not quite sure how to deal with this. It seems like there are brain chemicals involved since medicines do change things and how I feel. However, therapy or medication thus far hasn't felt much joy. Yeah, usually it's drugs affecting dopamine, like Wellbutrin, like amantadine, that some suggest can help with motivation and enjoyment and fulfillment. Dopamine itself is not a joy chemical. There's probably more endogenous cannabinoids. It begins with an A and it's not amantadine, and I'm going to butcher it if I'm trying to remember. Endogenous, native to the body cannabinoids and other chemicals, maybe even oxytocin, have probably more to do with the actual experience of joy. So Max Doppler is asking, does DXM, and I'm not actually knowing what DXM is, what the abbreviation stands for. So I'll either Google it up or hello, or so Modima is asking, well, perhaps stimulants in general could be very effective for people struggling with addiction. Slippery slope, though. So there are several studies looking at Vyvanse in particular. Again, Vyvanse has a slow release mechanism. It's linked to the amino acid lysine. So injecting it, snorting it only allows at most very tiny concentrations of the active molecule. But Vyvanse in a population that's abusing stimulants in treatment for it increases the rate of sticking with treatment, increases the rate of being abstinent from other forms of stimulants. So on the whole, that doesn't mean for everyone it's a good choice, but it does seem to be helpful. So Modima is asking Neo if he gets enough sun. They get enough sunlight in terms of their anhedonia. Sunlight has an effect on mood. Yep. So my email connected to this channel is drjohn, drjohnkruse @gmail.com. What I should say is that I'm providing this question and answer service and other chats or interactions as an information opportunity. So I don't have a doctor-patient relationship with you. Even if you send me really long emails, I still won't know all of your history, all of your physical issues and problems. So anything I say should be interpreted and taken as general information that you should review with your prescribing physicians and or other medical team. So, but if you don't want to share it out here, that's fine. Or you can share it here and say, my friend does this. Hello, Dennis. So Dennis asked, when using stimulants, why does it does irritability occur after the dopamine peak but not before it? And would addition of an SSRI help? So I'd say in general, irritability can happen for some individuals. I mean, some people, that's the first sign that their medication is starting to kick in the morning. So in terms of people overall using stimulants, some never have irritability, many have irritability that's decreased or improved by being on the stimulants. Some feel restless or irritable as it's starting to work, and some as it's later on as it's working or as it's falling off. So one is that irritability may be, and this is gross overgeneralizations, related as much to norepinephrine status, so too high sympathetic tone, as much as, and might be less important for dopamine, so that theoretically you could be affecting in a different sequential manner or proportion the norepinephrine and dopamine at different times. So Max came up with the endogenous opioid that's probably more associated with joy than dopamine per se. So dopamine seems to be more related to reward processing and checking whether what you're receiving is better or worse than what you were imagining or anticipating. That's a shorthand, and I'm omitting some information, but it's not actually associated with joy itself. So, and I have a talk on this when people talk about, oh, I just got the hit of dopamine and I'm feeling addicted or feeling joyous relief. It's almost certainly a different part of the pathway or step. So I'm not saying dopamine isn't part of that process, but the actual release of dopamine isn't particularly joyful or experienced as such. It's probably anandamide and other chemicals. And again, I think I have a whole talk on it. I know I've written on that in a Medium article. So Neospios is just returning to Modima Rose's comment. That doesn't seem to be vitamins or sunlight seems to be the problem. There's not a seasonal pattern. So they're back and forth there. Eternal Battle 14. Can ADHD cause chronic fatigue? So I do have a separate talk on fatigue. What's fascinating, so fatigue is a subject. I mean, there can be objective aspects of it. So muscle fatigue is you can measure how well a muscle performs given a stimulus at one time versus given the same stimulus at a different, before or after exercise. But in terms of subjective energy levels or non-muscle, psychic, brain, cognitive fatigue, that's much harder to measure. And it's clearly a strongly subjective, self-defined measure. So I'll talk about Frank. He's the person that got me interested in ADHD more than 30 years ago, and probably still the most severe case I've had. But Frank would come in talking a mile a minute, would pace around the room, would be completely engaged in a very energetic mode while talking with me. But a big part of what he would talk about was how he felt tired all the time, how he was fatigued, how he was crashing. And particularly some of it was he'd engage in an interaction or he'd work on a project for a brief period of time and then crash afterwards. So yes, fatigue is commonly associated with ADHD, but it's interesting that from an outside view, someone can be seen as being highly energetic, and yet their subjective sense can be that they are fatigued and dragging most of the time. Also, again, I think there is overexertion and over involvement in activities, which can burn calories and lead to energy deprivation and crashing. A reminder that the brain burns more calories, oxygen, sugar, than any of your major muscle groups. So just thinking intently, when we say, oh boy, I'm really tired, that's not just a metaphor or an extension, or just that there are physical effects of thinking hard. So, and people who have fatigue. So I mean, the stimulants do seem to be effective at reducing fatigue. The other thing to remember, though, is the body does need, and brain needs, some rest and restoration time each day or night, particularly at night. So having a goal that you're going to be productive solidly for 18 hours and only sleep 6 at night, or even 16 hours and sleep at night, is not a realistic biological regimen for anyone, even though there's lots of Silicon Valley tech bros and others who think that they can optimize the human body and it won't need much rest or restoration time. So yeah, so again, respect, I mean, so siesta time is a real biological phenomena. I mean, so having some respect for normal biological rhythms and the likelihood that you should be tired some of the time and you need time to recover is, so don't use stimulants just to push you to be up and working or up and active or up and productive all the waking day. Flynn Max is saying that research on blue light seems contentious. I have not read a lot of the recent research, but I mean, the things that were established more than 15 years ago is that we know our circadian clock is sensitive to light, and that is to light coming in through our retina rather than from our skin. There might be a few locations on the skin that also have some import, but particularly for seasonal depression, full spectrum light contains blue light. You know, we're not seeing it as a piece of blue and a piece of red and a piece of green, but the whole spectrum is present in white light. The blue blocking, so part of what, there are blue blocking glasses which look orangish, which people can use, and many of the phones and laptops and others have settings now so that less of the blue light is emitted at nighttime. But if you're still, so light can have a circadian rhythm disruptive effect on the clock, but even if you just close your eyes and are listening to a vigorous detective story or action-packed thriller or romance or whatever it is you're listening to, being engaged and activated through the content of whatever you're looking at also is serving to keep people awake. So in terms of disrupting circadian clocks or rhythms, light is one factor, but activity, mental engagement can also make it harder to go to sleep. So Mr. AKA says, there is a song that I feel like really speaks to me and probably other people with ADHD on the issues related to gauging time. It's called Caroline by Mad Wave. Worth a listen. I will write it down. I'm not familiar with it. I mean, it's interesting that there's a number of songs now in the last 10, 15 years where they overtly, directly talk about not just depression, but other ADHD in particular. So there's AWOL Nation, you know, blame it on my ADHD, which again, in my generation, back when I was college age or younger, nobody would have written such a lyric because it wouldn't have resonated or meant anything to anyone. So I think it's good that we are at least talking more about these things and there's more awareness. So James Festini says his ADHD is unaffected by Adderall, taking 30 XR at 6 a.m. and another 30 XR at noon. No energy boost. I'm 52 now and started with Ritalin, which he took from 8 to 14 and stopped until he was 50. Maybe switch to another. So one is I would try to use some quasi-objective measures to see if other things are improving other than just energy. So hopefully there can be, how quickly you are finishing your Sudoku, or how quickly you can check all the emails and not get stuck in rabbit holes, or some measure of concentration, focus, attention, productivity may help fine-tune whether the Adderall is having some impact, whether or not you're feeling an energy boost. So again, stimulants do three different general things. They do help with cognitive executive functioning, they do help with energy level, and they do help with emotions, elevating those. They don't have to affect all three dimensions in the same way for the same people. And many times people are more aware of improvement in those areas when they've stopped the medication at the end of the day and it's wearing out and there's withdrawal or rebound, or just being aware that it's no longer doing that. The second thing is Adderall XR is just one product, and depending on how long you've been trying it, that is a hefty dose. So it'd be interesting whether, when you were on Ritalin years ago, whether those were robust doses or mild doses, but particularly if your recollection is that Ritalin helped back then, that to me is a logical thing to retry something that worked 30, 40 years previously. So Modima Rose is also pointing out that now we address neurodivergence instead of just labeling everything a pathology. So yes, I think that's a good and helpful thing. So Platinum says, 2 years ago, I attempted to take their life and was hospitalized for 3 days. Since then, I've been struggling with guilt. It haunts me daily. It's always in my head. Is there anything I can do? So two things. I do have a talk on suicide in this video thing, and I also have a talk on shame and shame connected with ADHD. So we know two big factors at a psychological level contribute to the risk for suicide. One that we focus a lot on is despair, depression, sort of negativity, hopelessness, but the other is impulsivity. And the impulsivity element is widely understudied, under-recognized, under-acknowledged. But people with ADHD, if you have ADHD diagnosed in childhood, on average, your lifespan is about 10 years less than a kid who grows up without ADHD. And about half of that excess death is from accidents, car accidents, other dangerous things, from being impulsive, from being unaware, from not checking things out, from not thinking the consequences. But the other half is suicide. So suicide is a major issue that is underaddressed in ADHD. But if it's so getting back to the guilt shame issue, and there are distinctions between the two, but I'm going to blur them together for right now. And I use a DBT dialectic behavioral therapy format for dealing with this emotion. And that is, if you truly feel that trying to take your life was something wrong and bad, what you do. So shame and guilt make you want to hide, make you want to shut up, make you not want to speak out. So part of the approach is to work against what those are encouraging you to do, and to say out loud, okay, this is what I did. And out loud does seem to have more strength even than writing it, or writing it probably in a public forum. This is what I did. And I think it's wrong because my own beliefs about who should be able to end their own life or not don't include this. And this is what I'm going to be doing in the future to make sure I don't do that again. If, on the other hand, this is just not wrong, and I'm of the belief that you are the only one who should be able to determine whether you continue your own life or not, and whether or not you make a different decision at a different point in time, that's also your right. My philosophy and many other philosophers would say that there's nothing intrinsically wrong or immoral about this, and then the approach there is, if you didn't think you did anything wrong, it would be to say, okay, I did this. I have been feeling bad about that, but on further thought, I didn't do anything that was wrong. So I will not continue to feel bad about it. So again, part of it is a dichotomy, deciding whether this, again, is in line with your own values and systems. If it is a wrong, then it's to figure out what you'll do to make it less likely you will do that again. And if it wasn't wrong, you could still agree that you don't want to do it again, but then you don't need to be feeling guilty there. So I hope that's a little helpful. Neospios, how should people with ADHD deal with caffeine, considering something in the is mildly stimulating? Might we also have to reconsider our optimized caffeine intake at certain times? So I do have a whole video on caffeine. It's most issues in the ADHD world are that the ADHD experts sort of have great unanimity on many topics. Caffeine seems to be one they're roughly equally split. Half of them say, yes, caffeine is a stimulant. It's working indirectly on dopamine, mostly directly on adenosine, but it has stimulant properties. But it's a lousy stimulant, meaning that for its same effective dose, you are getting more sleep disruption, you're getting more physical agitation, you're even getting more cardiac effects. Usually we're using it at a lower dose, and because it's a bad stimulant, you should just cut it out of your life. And the third thing is, it's hard to quantitate. Even if you're going to the same supplier for your caffeine fix each day, you may be getting a different dose each day. So they would say it's messy, has more problems, just cut it out completely and go with your prescription stimulants. The other half of the experts would say caffeine has, or most of the caffeine products, usually coffee, but caffeine or tea, has other health benefits, has other social benefits, may well be an important part of people's lives, as long as you are aware that it's there, aware that it has long-lasting effects on sleep. So most people really should be avoiding it after noon. Younger people tend to be able to get away with it for more easily than older people can. But the half that say it's okay to use, just be aware that it will, if you've had more caffeine than usual today, you will probably feel the effects of your stimulant more strongly. So I am not a coffee drinker myself, so I don't have a horse in this race. So I'd say sort of figuring out if you can't use it consistently or count on it to behave consistently for you, then it might be helpful to eliminate it. So hello, Sumar Hasoon. Can you tell us if intrusive sleep is an ADHD symptom? Focusing for more than 5 minutes on a task like watching a not very engaging video causes crossing of the eyes and inability to focus gaze on it, which gradually becomes sleepiness. So if you're actually falling asleep in the middle of tasks, this is a not very engaging task. So if it's particularly falling asleep during engaging tasks, I would say that's more suggestive of narcolepsy, but particularly a not very engaging task or video for many people with ADHD is, I don't even know if I'd call it intrusive sleep. I would call it a response to the environment sleep. You're bored, there's nothing that's engaging you, and particularly since many people with ADHD to begin with are somewhat sleep deprived or have either from insufficient sleep or in consistent hours of sleeping, they have a need, they're more primed to fall asleep quickly when they are bored and nothing's stimulating them. So that's, I guess, my answer to that. Yeah, and Dima Rose echoes that she had chronic daytime drowsiness before her ADHD was properly handled. So again, whether we label intrusive sleep, but certainly fatigue, certainly daytime drowsiness are common. Many people wind up sleeping subjectively and objectively better when they take daytime stimulants. And Max is chipping in that it does seem like sustained mental effort does make fatigue more apparent than other activities. So again, sustained mental effort is actually burning real calories using, it's not just a metaphor that mental fatigue is translating into physical fatigue. They are connected. So it looks like we had some talk or questions on nicotine and some on free time. Nobody's commenting on jail time, but I guess none of you are currently incarcerated, so maybe. So Max has a really good question. He says, seems like a lot of people learn of their mental health diagnoses once it's too late and are in crisis. How can psychiatry aim to be more proactive than reactive? So I would say a whole lot of medicine is reactive. So it's, people weren't aware that they had buildup of plaque in their cardiac arteries till they have a heart attack, or weren't aware of other problems until they show up as problems. So this is I'd say a general medicine issue, not just specific to psychiatry. I think the danger or risk is overdiagnosing, over-sensitizing, over-pathologizing. Everyone gets sad some of the time. Sadness is an appropriate response to loss. And sadness and depression are different things, although they have some overlap. So again, distractibility, impulsivity, forgetfulness are all parts of ADHD, but you can have those without having ADHD. So part of how psychiatry is trying to be proactive. So one is most people don't show up at a psychiatrist's office until they are aware that they have a problem. Occasionally it's that everyone around them is telling them they have a problem and they're sure that they don't at all, if they're a narcissist or depending on what else they have. So probably more of the proactive work is going to be, and there's substantial projects, and I think there's been progress made with psychiatry interacting with family medicine, general practice, internal medicine practices. So now simple screening tools for depression, for ADHD are much more other doctors are aware of these and more of them employ them. And because insurance companies like them and can check off check boxes, or doctors need to do these things to get evaluated, more people are being screened. Again, the important thing to recognize, and sometimes the doctors administering them aren't even, is that these are screening tools. Screening tools are tools designed to identify who might need greater evaluation. They're not designed to form a complete diagnosis, but they can be useful in pediatric center. There's lots of looking at adverse childhood events. There's many more formalized ways of scanning and screening for some mental health conditions than we had years ago. Again, all of that requires that you actually have seen a doctor, which many people don't until things are too late. So there are also public service announcements. Other than that, I'm not coming up with any startling, innovative ways to reach out to people myself. What I would say is, I think in the future, and this is maybe creepily intrusive to most people, I think Apple and Google and Facebook probably know much more about who is depressive, who is pre-depressive, who is ADHD than they are acknowledging or sharing. But we know, they are measuring activity levels. They are measuring rates and change of speed of verbal interaction, pitch of verbal interaction, choice of words, all sorts of things that give a much more neurolinguistically informative rating on mood, on attention problems, on a whole host of things. Whether we will get to the stage where they have a responsibility to notify people, hey, looks like you're dealing with this, maybe you should get attention, or not, I don't know whether we will get there or whether we should get there. Sulaiman Bisharat says, how do you manage ADHD anger? So great question. I'll give a two-pronged approach. One is a medication approach. So even though we talked a little bit earlier that stimulants and other medications can increase irritability, they can increase anger. Most of the research indicates that if anger irritability is a problem coming in, the right dose of a stimulant can actually help reduce that and help you manage it. Second thing is understanding that anger comes about because we perceive something to be unfair and usually that we can't do much about it. And that's it. Many times people say, no, it doesn't have anything to do with unfairness. I was driving today and this idiot cut me off on the highway and I got angry because he was being an asshole. But there are other people driving poorly, in the lane 6 lanes over. Didn't interfere with you. Why did you get angry there? You got angry because it was unfair to you that your either safety or your timing or your whatever was being impinged on by this person's behavior. So understanding the unfairness can help you say, okay, yes, that was unfair. What are the other aspects of this situation that I'm in charge of that I can focus on? Because there are always a dozen different ways to look at any specific situation. It's never, the simple answer to that is this guy cut off 15 other people. How many of them are screaming and giving the finger and honking their horn and raging? Some, and some are just driving on their own way. So it's the situation itself never mandates a specific emotional response. It may logically flow from that. It's not saying it's bad or inappropriate. The question is, once you're aware of it, you can decide, is this a helpful reaction or not? And if you're chronically angry, then it's important to look at what feels unfair overall. So you could be in the mindset it's unfair to have to deal with ADHD in a non-ADHD world. That there is truth to that. There's chronic unfairness. Or it could be you're being treated unfairly because you have ADHD. So if there is chronic anger, then it's helpful to try to look at and sort out. And again, usually reframing, because usually if you perceive there to be unfairness or injustice, it's usually there. Not always. There's places people overuse that strategy. So it's not rationalizing and saying, no, it's completely fair to have this maniac driving around and cutting people off in traffic. It's not. But again, unless you make the unfairness the biggest, most important part of the situation, you don't get angry. You get sad. You might think it funny. You might think it other things. So Modima Rose is bringing up misdiagnoses or most of my life, and the effects of that were devastating, nearly killed me. So I'm sorry for your pain. I'm glad that you found a diagnosis. And I mean, there's big elements in the anti-ADHD industry that think we have created a diagnosis or making it up. And I see so many more people who clearly, robustly meet the full criteria, have met it their whole life, and then the mental health system treated them for depression, treated them for anxiety, treated them for PTSD, while ignoring the fundamental ADHD that probably preceded all this. And if you aren't diagnosing something accurately, you're not likely to provide effective treatment. So what the actual numbers are in terms of overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis, it's hard to gather good data on that, and I don't think anyone's really even attempted to do a study with that. So Pinecone Hatfaluti says, I got my perception. I think it's prescription, although maybe you did get your perception for Ritalin today. I'm picking up the pills tomorrow morning. Any tips for when I take them every day? I'm on 10 milligram Ritalin long lasting, 2 peaks at 2 to 4 hours, and then a slow decline. Again, I don't like, again, I can't offer direct medical advice. What I would recommend is planning ahead what you're going to do and sticking to that schedule. And then when you are and try it 2 or 3 days, because there's lots of individual variability. But when you are, when you see what the results are at different time, then manipulate one variable at a time instead of trying 2 or 3 different things different ways. So that may not be very helpful. Part of it is there's a lot of variability. There's some people with immediate release Ritalin who only feel it for 2 to 4 hours. There's some people who the immediate release lasts the entire day. I mean, ideally, you would want to be taking a second dose if you're knowing that it's always wearing off before that one wears off, so you're not going up and down, but you're timing it optimally. And knowing, again, that there's a siesta time is a normal circadian rhythm time of decreased alertness for most people. So you may either need a bigger dose or may need to respect your biology more at that point of the day. So Mr. AKA says, regarding treating untreated inmates with ADHD has a big impact on recidivism rates. Don't know if you talked about that. So I do in the talk. So yes. So what do you think about prosecutors offering deals if defendant medicates their condition? I think our whole legal system and judicial system and penal systems have major problems. And I'm not sure what the best way or how much we should be thinking about how much mental health conditions mitigate guilt or responsibility. I don't think, what I would say is I don't think they absolve people of responsibility, but I do think that they should be taken into consideration. What to me is absolutely shocking, and there's not been a lot of them, but there have been a few cases recently or in the last decade of people in the US shooting, killing people, often multiple people, where they were clearly, undeniably in a psychotic state. The people they killed are dead. I get that. That's horrible suffering. That's horrible loss. But in most of those cases, an insanity defense wasn't even proposed, or if it was proposed, it's been rejected. Part of it is when the crime seems so horrible or bloody or messy, or young kids or puppies are killed, then people logically, I get it, respond that this was a horrendous, horrible act and we should punish. But again, if your brakes on your car go out and you plow into a crowd of revelers, that should be treated differently than someone intentionally getting in their car and aiming their car at people to kill them. So motivation, I think, should be an important part, but it does get tricky, and particularly in the US, because the legal system is a adversarial system. It's not a justice system. Almost always you can find experts who are willing to come up with a diagnosis or claim that a diagnosis isn't there. So it gets really murky when we try to use or explain or understand horrible events and how someone's mental health played a role in that. So Carol asks how to manage or postpone decisions to avoid making bad decisions. So that's a really good question, and it's a tricky one. And part of it, I would say, is, and I talk a little bit about this about ADHD in the workplace. One is to have the people around you, whether it's family, whether it's workplace, whether it's colleagues, being proactive about your ADHD, saying, part of how I operate is sometimes I blurt out statements. Sometimes I volunteer for tasks when I'm really overloaded before. Sometimes I'm doing X, Y, or Z, and it's not my whole self or best self that's made that decision. So if you pre-warn people ahead of time, that gives you more leeway for. The second thing is backing out. You're allowed to say in most situations, yes, I did volunteer to lead the retirement party for Joe, but I'm actually on vacation myself for the next 2 weeks, so I won't be here. So you're allowed to acknowledge that you agree to do something that doesn't make sense for you to agree to, and apologize for having jumped in there. Medications are one way to help slow down the impulsivity and give yourself more time. There are other sort of mindfulness ways of learning, wait a minute, yeah, I'm about to raise my hand if I'm about to do X. I've gotten into trouble before, but part of the ADD itself makes that harder to be mindful. So I hope that's a starting place. So Max is saying, I've read that about 20% of individuals with ADHD don't benefit from stimulants. Do they actually have no effect on them, or is it the side effects are too overwhelming at any dose? So that's a good question. All these have been good questions today. So the answer is usually or often when they sort of throw out general numbers like that, that's just who are no longer taking it, who tried it initially. And most studies aren't breaking it down more finely. A few do, as to who didn't seem to get any positive response versus who had some response, but the adverse side effects overwhelmed or were made the cost benefit balance such that taking it didn't make any sense. I don't have a good general breakdown. So many of the studies are actually even a little bigger than 20% in terms of who don't continue with it or don't seem to have a net benefit. My own clinical experience would probably be somewhere in the 10 to 15% don't seem to be benefiting. And so far, we don't have any biochemical or other markers or symptom markers to pre-identify who won't get a good response or who won't get any benefit at all. Any other questions? So I do have a firm stop in a few minutes anyway, but so Richard asks a big and a loaded question. So I do have to stop at 11, but Richard has a good question. Are SPECT scans useful? So there are people who have been pushing PET scans, SPECT scans, other brain imaging techniques for more than 20 years, claiming they can identify certain subtypes of ADHD, that there are certain characteristic patterns of brain activation. And the problem with those studies are, one, nobody seems to be able to replicate them. Two, that many of these are not even based on published studies. They're just the assertions of certain clinical or commercial laboratories. So clearly ADHD is emanating from the brain. Clearly there should be something characteristic there, but whether that means the ADHD brain is fully identifiable is different from the non-ADHD brain is a problem. So on lots of studies, we can show group differences. So we can show higher activation of, or less activation of a subset of the frontal cortex among ADHD people than of people without ADHD. The problem is that these aren't two discrete groups, that it's not ADHD people are all scoring in this range and all non-ADHD are here. So there's a lot of overlap. So on average, still ADHD is higher, non-ADHD is lower if this is a scale vertically, but picking out where an individual is or an individual score and using that as a diagnostic measure just is no good because there's so much overlap. So if you have lots of money and you want to get a very colorful picture of what your brain is looking at a certain task, so some of the other factors are, it matters a lot what the brain is, whether you're looking at a resting state, whatever a resting state is, or whatever is specific task. If you're asking different tasks, that may show up different patterns. So I'll stop right there. Some of that I've talked about in our tests useful for ADHD, I think it's called, a video. So Sir Austin asks, hello doctor, can Adderall cause dehydration? I've been dealing with some bad headache at the end of the day, but not sure if it's related to meds or cutting Diet Coke. So dehydration is referring to fluid balance, fluid salt balance in the body. So usually Adderall shouldn't have a strong impact on that, but Adderall does have an effect on norepinephrine innervation, including of the mucous membranes of the mouth. So dry mouth is certainly common with stimulants. But again, that's separate from dehydration. It may be helped by sipping water during the day. Headaches, certainly dehydration can cause headaches, but tension can cause headaches, a whole bunch of other things. Sympathetic nervous system overactivation could cause headaches. So Sulaiman Bisharat asks, what are the medications for ADHD anger besides SSRI, SNRI? So actually, the more research has been shown on stimulants, full-blown stimulants, as being helpful for ADHD-based anger and impulsivity. For anger outside of ADHD, there's some research on looking at Depakote or other mood stabilizers. Again, my approach is usually a psychotherapy approach in combination with adjusting medication. Guanfacine does certainly help some people with ADHD be less emotionally overwrought and negative in their emotions. I don't know if there's specific studies looking at it for anger per se. So I'll be back next week. Thanks for the questions today. They were great. Stay healthy, stay happy. And if any questions come in the next few minutes or minute as I'm shutting things down, I will try to answer them next week. Bye.